Hey, good afternoon, Zach. How are you today? How's things
I'm
going?
great. How are you, James?
I'm hanging in there, enjoying some of the Southeast Michigan weather. We've got about 83 degrees today. Uh, Finally getting some movement on the bees and seeing some pollen coming in, and they're probably getting some nectar off the maples. So we're happy here. We're happy here. Um, I wanted to do a follow-up with you because it's been a few weeks since we chatted and you did a presentation for the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild, which was excellent, by the way. It was probably one of the best presentations I've watched so far this year. We're 4 months in, but I'm going to find it hard pressed to beat it.
Well, thank you for the compliments. That was awesome to do the video with y'all, and I was happy with how much publicity I got.
Yeah, it was amazing. So I'm just looking at right now. We're looking at 12,000 views, almost 13,000 actually, which is pretty significant considering the data, the title, the information that was presented. It's almost kind of a bit of a shock value because it changes your perspective and makes you think about what you're currently doing as a beekeeper and how we're waging war with the varroa mites. Is this something new? Is this something that can help us? Because we also desperately want to have a positive impact for our honeybees.
Yeah, well, when I originally had that finding, I knew it was going to be significant. And then after about 3 years of work, we knew it was going to change the paradigm of beekeeping. And I was interested in knowing how excited beekeepers are going to be, because every time I would talk about this work at a club, the beekeepers would get really excited. And I know it's for a couple of reasons. One, we like novel things, but two is people love their bees and people work really hard to keep their bees alive. Unfortunately, so many people are on the same treadmill, which is they get a nuke or package in the spring, it grows up, produces some honey, and then it dies in the fall or the early winter. And even people who are able to regularly overwinter colonies have to work extremely hard, splitting colonies, making new colonies, and pampering them. And they still have mediocre results year after year, or they'll do well for a while and then have these complete crashes. The concise way to put it is, it's really hard keeping bees alive still. And that's been the way for 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings kind of the recalls a little bit about the curve that we're facing. Being myself even a fairly new beekeeper in comparison to so many of my peers, that we're kind of up against it, and that you're constantly kind of reinventing your approach. That even if you've had a good 7-year, 8-year run, there seems to be these moments of disaster. Like a complete crash or a large significant loss in an apiary that's doing all of the things right. But the varroa seem to have found a way to have such an impact on the honeybees that they just devastating loss.
Yeah, so this isn't the most surprising thing to me, and I'm going to say that because, and I said it in the last talk, it's a pretty unstable relationship. And I'm quoting Dr. Jay Evans when I say it's an unstable relationship. I really like his description of varroa viruses and the honeybee in that way. So I pointed out in the talk that this is a very unique relationship, because most infectious diseases on Earth are either vector-borne or transmitted from host to host in a communicable mode, but they're not both. And in the few diseases that are transmitted in both ways, they completely devastate the host population. So one of them is plague, that wiped out half of people in Europe in the Middle Ages. Or there are things like the salmon isovirus, which can take a farm salmon facility and just wipe out every single salmon. And these eruptions seem to be unpredictable. You could probably mathematically model them, and people have made careers out of trying to do that. But what these are really complex disease systems. And whenever we talk about parasites in honeybees, especially when we talk about varroa, we're always talking about multiple parasites. So we have the macro parasite, which is varroa destructor. That's my big parasite. And then we have our micro parasite, which are all the viruses that could be vectored by varroa. And you can never talk about one without the other. So if I talked about varroa destructor feeding on bees, I'm talking about varroa destructor feeding on bees while vectoring some sort of virus into those bees. And it's often deformed wing virus or one of the variants. And what we really neglect to talk about is the generational times of either of those parasites is far faster than the generational time of our host. And what do I mean by that? Well, varroa destructor reproduces, what is it, every 12 days? So its generation time is in days. Viruses replicate, in hours. So they replicate very, very quickly. So either of those are going to have mutations that higher frequency than our honeybee, because honeybees only replicate once or twice a year. The individual bees that are born inside of your colony, that doesn't count as a generation. It's when your colony swarms and produces new queens, or when drones successfully mate with a new queen, then we have a new generation. And that is on the annual basis for a honeybee. So we have this literal arms race between multiple parasites and a host. And unfortunately, those parasites have a leg up because they can mutate that much quicker than our honeybee host can. And we're trying to, observe selective breeding or natural selection on our host population in a time frame that might not span out necessarily in our human lives. And so it's a really complex system for me that's fun to study, that we often simplify way too much with these one-liners on the internet. And I always caution people from doing that, not because I don't like to have a debate, but because it's that complex of a disease system, and it seems that someone can read something and 30 seconds later put a two-liner rebuke against it that they're very emotively tied to. But the fact is, it's this complex disease system. It's also an evolutionary host jump, because this is a new macro parasite onto our host bee population. So that's totally novel. And not only that, when varroa jumped over to Apis mellifera, it could have jumped over and not vectored a single virus. It was actually capable of vectoring honeybee viruses, which is even more novel. So we have this really complex novel system, and it creates these unstable losses that we see every once in a while.
Yeah, and so I think that's kind of what generated a lot of the excitement with the video, is because there's a potential edge for the beekeeper, even if it's just a monitoring edge. And we saw a lot of comments, we saw a lot of positive comments, we saw some negative comments, and that's to be expected.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of that from the Bee Guild side, because we posted the video. How about the response for you? What was that like? What was the excitement for your side of things after the video posted? How did you feel about the feedback?
The feedback I loved. So I got a bunch of emails, quite a few emails from researchers and beekeepers alike, and they were varied. Everyone that reached out was supportive, wanted me to have some new information, or saw a talk that they wanted to provide some information. And several people wanted to join the Citizen Science Project, which was a particular thing that really excited me. Historically, I haven't been excited about citizen science projects. I always kind of looked down at them for no particular reason, and always thought they're probably too difficult to run or anything. And now I find myself in the midst of one and being very excited about it. So I was excited for that. Some of the negative comments, I usually just dismiss them. And part of it is because if I got upset or thought too much about every negative thing posted on the internet, I would never be able to walk out my door and actually live my life. The internet's a medium where someone could watch something or read part of something and then give any reply that they want very quickly. And without more context, I don't necessarily know what that person meant. And so for me, the best thing is just to engage with people that are actually asking very good questions. And that was the most exciting things. Beekeepers ask some really, really good questions. And I think this proves that beekeepers are really good researchers. And I don't mean that in a pedantic way at all. Beekeepers are constantly experimenting.
Yeah.
Sometimes to their own detriment, but they're constantly experimenting. And they got this new novel information. And what did beekeepers do? They asked, how can I change my management? What new management practice can I come up with? Can I use this as a mite control? Can I use this as a sampling technique? I don't even think some of them got to the part of my video where I said, we're coming up with a new sampling technique. And beekeepers were already circulating in their head, I can use this as a sampling technique, which my response is awesome. Seriously. It just proves beekeepers are researchers. And I saw online all of these messages. And, I think probably the best example of it was Fred saw the video, had an idea, posted it, and look at the engagement that he had for an idea that he came up with. It may work, it may not work, but what did it do? Beekeepers are engaged and they want to see, can I manage mites using a new method?
Yeah, and for a lot of folks that are alternative minded and looking for a better way to address the issue, being still mindful of the problem that the varroa mite is causing for beekeepers, which says a lot, I think, for those particular beekeepers themselves. We still want to find a way to deal with this problem, but we want to do it in the least restrictive and least toxic way possible. And as you mentioned, Fred Dunn and the method that he had proposed was a good example of that. What's the word I'm looking for? The diversity and constructive thinking that keepers come up with. So, and with that, I don't know if you have your project in mind, and at the end of the video had mentioned the sampling techniques and management strategies. So you had the intention, obviously, in that presentation to address that, and you did. But now, with all of the feedback and all of the things that have occurred since the video posted a couple weeks ago, where do you think management strategies at large are going? And where does this research really land in the big scheme of things?
Sure. I think it's going to be different based upon how many colonies you have. So for commercial beekeepers, whenever I've shared this information with them, they really focus on that schematic I had where it showed how many of your worker bees are parasitized in the midsummer once the drones disappear. And it was that schematic where 60% of the bees are parasitized in 9 days. They see that, and I could just see their brains work, and they're like, man, I got to treat a lot earlier. Yeah. So the concise way to put it is, I think we're going to see treatments occur earlier than they are now, because what the data is now showing is the more and more and more you wait, the more and more of your worker bees are actually parasitized by mites. And once they're bit, you can't take away that bite. I can't remove that mite damage once it occurs. That's the first thing I think that we'll end up seeing. And I hope that is the case, because I know for a lot of commercial beekeepers, they get towards that end of that summer and they have to think about, do I want to try to make some money off the fall flow? And if you got a few thousand colonies, 10 or 20 pounds a colony adds up very quickly. The problem, as I see it, is they make so much money in almonds, which is only a few months away. If they have high mite levels, do they really want to risk any of that almond money for a little bit of fall honey? And the answer should probably be no. For hobbyist beekeepers and sideliners who have smaller number of colonies and can work their colonies more intimately. And what I mean is you can spend more time pulling frames and working individually on a colony. What I think they're going to do is try to come up with some creative ways to remove the mites early or try to detect them early. And that's what I'm really excited about. So what I think beekeepers are going to start to do is sample drones, and when they identify colonies with high mites, they'll see the painting, the writing on the wall. They're going to understand that this is going to be heavily infested later on. Can I deal with this right now in the spring or the summer, instead of waiting for an economic threshold and an alcohol wash to be surpassed later in the year? So that's where I think management strategies are going to go. How they get there, I'm not quite sure. There's a problem as I see it in beekeeping, which is many of us want to avoid a treatment at all costs. We come up with really creative ways to make pseudo treatments. Yeah. And that's okay. I think that experimenting is good, but we have to, at the end of the day, look, what the management that I did or the treatment that I applied, did it effectively manage mite levels? If the answer is no, then at some point I have to deal with that colony and those mites in it. And so when Fred essentially posts, can we siphon out mites on adult drones and remove the colonies that way? That's a great idea. If it doesn't work, though, we have to acknowledge to ourselves it didn't work, or it did, one of the two, and then either come up with another management strategy that will work or a treatment. But I just want to, I hope that at the end of the day, if someone needs to treat, they will. And the reason I say that, and this is where I got some pushback online, and I'm okay with that. I actually hope that we can get to a point where we're all treatment free. That'd be amazing. It really would.
Yeah.
But in my own research apiaries, I run up against this wall, which is I have these colonies that get heavily infested, and I need to treat them to remove the mites because I don't want them to crash or to keep shedding mites into nearby healthy colonies. Because
Right.
I'll be doing a research project on a healthy colony, and come late July, it's loaded with mites. And I know where they came from. I had 3 colonies, like nearby that were loaded with mites. And if I'm doing a pesticide study, the study's done. I now have so many mites, it's going to confound any potential observations I can make on the impact of a pesticide on that colony, simply because of all the varroa moving into it. Well, if I'm a beekeeper and I'm trying to identify queens that can naturally suppress mite reproduction, I would want to be able to do those observations without constant emigration into those colonies from neighboring mite-infested colonies. We want to be able to make those observations without these confounders. And so one thing that I'm hoping that comes out of these management strategies is people realize that, hey, I have this colony, it's heavily infested. It's going to be even more infested later. It's going to impact the health of my actual colonies that have low infestations. I should probably manage those mites right now, either treat it, remove it, or implement some sort of management strategy that's effective at removing mites. I know that was a bit long-winded, James, and I probably could have said it more concisely, but that's where I think management's going to go, essentially earlier management.
So quintessentially, I mean, in this kind of, it's slightly inferred after all of the feedback and the follow-up from the video was, that there was possibly a suggestion that this was somehow being presented in a way that this is a new mite mitigation strategy or is a way to avoid further sampling. And I don't necessarily feel like for my interpretation, obviously conducting the interview or the meeting, but then watching it afterwards because I could then digest it all. But I didn't really draw a conclusion that you were suggesting we stop sampling.
No, I'm definitely not. And I usually say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The alcohol wash has been the standard method that we've almost universally have used to sample for mites in this country. And so just tossing it out the window does everyone a disservice as far as I can see, because now you have no standard sampling methodology to communicate to someone else. If I emailed a colleague right now and said if I found 5% of my drones are infested with mites, they'd have no way to respond to that. They have no context of what that means. Whereas I could say I had a 5% alcohol wash and they instantly know what that means. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so what we're doing for a research project is we're pairing these drone samplings that we're doing with a traditional alcohol wash, because we want to see how do they compare, or can we predict them. The next is, we didn't offer a mite mitigation strategy in this video. When we were hand sampling from drones, this is simply for detections and to provide new information on varroa destructor. So other people had jumped on with, we could use this as mite mitigation. I think the idea that they had, which was if they could cage drones in a specific area, then they could remove them and that would siphon mites out of the colony. I would jump right there, and I try to simplify things as much as possible. And if it's more complex than removing a drone comb frame, then I just say, don't do it, just remove the drone comb frame.
Yeah.
And I also have this joke, which is we will go at lengths to not do drone comb removal.
Yeah.
Which it really does seem ridiculous to me. So Calderon did some really good work in New York. I think it was late 90s, early 2000s, and showed that drone comb removal is an effective mite control strategy. It's not a silver bullet. It's absolutely not a silver bullet, but it's an effective strategy. It's extremely easy to use. It's non-chemical. And yet the majority of beekeepers that I mentioned it to are very interested in it, and then also bring up tons of reasons why they shouldn't do it. The number one being, well, how am I going to mate my queens? And I always say, even if you remove a drone comb from every single colony every month, you're still going to have plenty of drones for your queens to mate. plus your neighbors probably aren't doing drone comb removal, so you're going to have plenty of drones. I also bring up that if you have colonies that are heavily infested with mites, you probably don't want those drones mating with your new queens anyways. I would suggest doubling down on the drone comb removal from those colonies. And also, drone comb removal is extremely easy. All it requires you to do is remove the frame once every 3 weeks. And if I was to tell someone, hey, I need help grafting and making a cell builder, could you come over on this date? You know, there's beekeepers that would drop just to kind of come over and learn that. But if I said, hey, can you do a organic mite control method? You just have to be in your colonies every 3rd Saturday. You know, all of a sudden it's like not possible. So this is me kind of snarking a little bit, but one of the things, as we're just approaching the season, hey, we're just getting into it.
I don't like doing it, so you're hitting
I
the nail on
know.
the head.
I love doing it. Well, think about, I didn't get the videos or the pictures up here, but I took some pictures of drone comb frames I have in my research apiaries right now. And I meant to show them to you today. I love doing it, but the feedback you get from a drone frame is amazing. So if I open a colony and it's bustling with bees and I pull out that drone frame and it's full of drone brood, I know that's a strong colony without any brood disease. That's what I can get from that frame. If I open up the colony, it's bustling and they're not drawing that drone comb, I immediately look for 2 things: queenlessness or brood disease, because they won't draw the comb in either of those scenarios. So I get so much feedback from a drone comb frame that helps my beekeeping, that I highly suggest people doing it. So anyways, in terms of, we didn't suggest any management strategies. A bunch of people proposed ones, and I would always go to parsimony. If it's more complex than just doing drone comb removal, do the drone comb removal.
Right, and especially for the new beekeeper who's watching the videos, right? Let's say you come to the YouTube, you're learning from the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild, and we're doing a lot of work getting this message out about sustainability and effective means to, you know, engage your colonies without deferring to prophylactic treatments all the time, you know, getting ahead of the curve. And one of the things that the new person sees is, oh, this looks like a great way to, you know, stay ahead of the curve. And I could do a sample without killing a bunch of nurse bees, which I don't like that part about washes, sugar shake, alcohol, dish soap, battery acid. I don't like doing any of it. And that is kind of a deterrent to doing it. So this kind of proposes an opportunity for a new beekeeper to do that. But at the same time, it raises the bar, at least as far as the technical skills required. And in your first year, like you're mentioning, pulling a drone comb, pretty easy and pretty effective. So
Exactly. And for your new beekeeper, I always mention beekeeping is just unfair to a new beekeeper anyways. So adding any level of difficulty to it is really unfair. But no, I mentioned that, and I had this talk about it. So halfway through college, I decided I wanted to farm, and I moved back to my grandfather's and finished up my undergrad on his farm, and I started milking cows. And milking cows is like a perfect way to learn something, and it's how we traditionally learn. So I didn't know, have you ever milked a cow before?
Goats, not cows.
Okay, but you've milked before. It doesn't like, you actually have to learn how to do it.
It doesn't look like they do in the cartoon. You just walk up to it and you just
you got to balance on the stool. You actually have to get her to give down, and then there's a certain way to squeeze. And the first time I went to milk a cow, that poor girl, but I had to go to the same cow in the same conditions 12 hours later, and then the next morning, and then the next evening. You very quickly learn how to milk that cow. But when you're a new beekeeper, you get a package, but the next week you don't shake another package. You only shake the package once. And then the next time you go to the hive, it's different conditions and a different task. And then the next time you go to the hive, it's different conditions and a different task. You don't get to repeat anything until a year later. Milking a cow every 12 hours, you get to repeat. Beekeeping, you don't do it until a year later. So it's so hard for new beekeepers to learn. And then the internet allows you to get all this new and often conflicting information. And then you have to go out into the wild and try it for the first time ever. I feel so bad for anyone just starting out, because I remember what it was like for me. It was extremely difficult. I made tons of mistakes, and I felt horrible about myself.
Yeah. Yeah, you had a conscience, Zach.
And I still do. A little less because we do kill a lot of bees as researchers, but I do.
Yeah, you got to develop some indifference when you're actually doing that part. Yeah. So Zach, a lot of a lot of questions came out of the presentation, and a lot of comments, a lot of positive feedback, a lot of reinforcement, and a lot of folks were just like, me, mind blown. But those of us who are familiar with, the reason for the alcohol wash and the phoretic stage of the varroa mite, some of us want to hear the thoughts on, obviously we know mites prefer drone brood to worker brood. There's a body of research that says that demonstrates that, and we feel pretty confident in saying this is true. And what we really want to know is, like, how does that affect the data? That if the mite prefers the drone brood, we would assume the data on phoretic mites would also favor drones, as they are statistically more likely to emerge with more mites on them.
Yeah, so that person has a point, and we're going to provide some new information to say why what I just shared is special. So we do know that mites prefer to invade drone brood over worker brood. And in some studies, it's like 50-1. So they highly prefer drone brood, these the L5 larvae, which are open for a longer period of time and are larger, and they can produce more daughters within that cell when they reproduce versus a worker cell, well established. And this is why drone comb removal is such an effective mite control strategy, because you can capture and then remove all those varroa.
A large portion of them.
Huge portion. And when those drones emerge, they're more likely to have mites on them and more mites on them than your emerging worker bees. That's absolutely true. This is where there's some new information from my findings. The first is mites are very mobile within a colony. They don't just stay on the bee that they emerge on. And that was already substantiated in laboratory studies. They saw 50% of mites left the host they emerged from within 24 hours. What I ended up showing in the lab is mites actually move from one adult bee to another at variable rates. Some almost never move, so they'll be on the same bee for 15 days, whereas some will move up to twice a day. So mites are moving across your adult bee population essentially at high frequencies. When we pick up drones, we are picking them up and we're marking them in a way so we can identify at that specific time how many mites are on that drone. We've marked hundreds of drones that had no mites on them, only to find that they gain mites over a 9-day period. And some of these drones gained up to 6 mites in a day. So we'd mark them on day 1, they'd have no mites. And then the next day they'd have 6 mites on them. I didn't miss seeing 6 mites in that first sampling method. So these mites are very mobile and they're moving onto these drones. Now think about that for a second. You've got approximately 50,000 bees in this colony, and those mites are choosing that one drone. Was that drone just the most unlucky bee in the whole colony?
Yeah.
Or was there something about those 2- and 3-day-old drones that made them really special? And so my response to that person is actually not to respond to the comment, because they're bringing up an important thing, which is, hey, we already had this information, so why is what you're presenting a surprise? It's to share, the findings that we have to provide new information. And when I provide that new information, this is my next thought, because it's now the research that we're doing. Why did 6 of those mites decide to move on to that one drone? Was it really just bad luck for that drone? Or is there a bouquet of cuticular hydrocarbons or smells that those mites are highly attracted to? And we want to know that answer, because the ultimate goal for us and me in my lab is, can we create a bait trap for varroa? To me, this would be the best management or treatment strategy, because mites aren't likely to be able to create resistance to it. And it wouldn't be a harsh chemical treatment. It'd be essentially a pheromone trap like you would use if you were an apple grower or a peach grower, where you put out these pheromone traps to capture flies. it'd be the same thing inside the colony. And that's the work that we're doing right now. So I'm actually, as I'm doing this interview, I have glassware being rinsed in hexane and some other glassware baking off. And I have drones in the field that I marked that emerged today. And tomorrow I'm going to go out there and I'm collecting a bunch of the drones that have tons of mites that moved onto them. And I'm also going to collect drones that had no mites move onto them. We'll do an extraction of them and take it to a mass spec lab and see, is there a huge difference in the cuticular hydrocarbons, and what is that difference? That's a little bit of an extension of what that person had shared, but James, the way I want to respond to that is just by providing new information, and then how can that new information help us?
Yeah, so that just helps kind of course a new direction in evaluating that question. But it still leaves one perplexed, because the phoretic data is indicating that the mites, like you said, they are dispersing, but they're favoring certain drones. Yep. But we're still seeing that you're not saying that they don't go to the nurse bees. You're not saying they won't end up on a nurse bee.
Nope.
Right?
I'm not saying that they don't.
So you're saying that a majority of them are favoring these particular drones.
Yeah.
But we're still going to see them on the nurse bees if we were to do an early season alcohol wash. We just may not see as many if we were to have been sampling the drones.
Exactly. And that's where we should probably get into this conversation by proportion. So if I were to sample 100 drones in my studies and 100 workers, by proportion, we would find more on those drones. And that's really how you should view that. It's not that you wouldn't find them on your workers. And if you look at any of my graphs, we have infestation on those worker bees. It's just far less than what we had on the drones. And when we do pull up a slide, one of the first ones is just that proportional difference of how many mites were on the drones compared to those worker bees. Yeah.
So we still have a valid threshold as far as the treatment data is concerned. If we're going based on a wash to evaluate our mites in what's the sample say? Here's my threshold. Now I can engage in my treatment modality.
Yeah, exactly. And also, let's just go back to that alcohol wash. I said, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. When I gave that presentation, I had paired the alcohol wash with data from our experiment, which showed how many of the worker bees were parasitized or observed with the mite over a 9-day period. And off the top of my head, at a 5% alcohol wash, which is high and above threshold, in 9 days, over 14% of your worker bees are parasitized when drones were present. So that was early season. Let's just halt for a second and think about what I just said in that data. Let's say we had a factory and we have 100 workers in that factory. According to my data, if we had 5% of us were infested, it would actually mean that almost 15 of us in that factory actually got bit or injured or in some way affected. That's a huge proportion of your population. And remember, that was just in a little over a week. These mites aren't just, they're not stopping any feeding on your adult bees after that week. They continue doing it. So it's actually a large percentage of your worker bees are parasitized. Those worker bees are responsible for everything that's going on in the colony in terms of resource acquisition, rearing brood, taking care of the queen. It really allows for viral circulation in your colony. And I want to jump on that word phoretic. I know Samuel Ramsey popularized this, but my work's really showing it. Mites are damaging your bees when they feed on them, when they're on adult bees. So we just published in PLOS Pathogens, and we showed that even with the presence of mites with no additional virus at all, you have a substantially higher mortality than if you just didn't have a single mite at all. And phoracy or phoretic simply means you have like a mite or a traveler on a host that's doing no damage at all. And what we actually have here are parasites damaging your host. So we really shouldn't in any way be using that word phoretic. I know Sammy already popularized that, but our data and our findings are just reinforcing it, which is it's not a phoretic period at all. And the language we use is really important because it's a non-reproductive stage of varroa destructor when it's killing your adult bees. And there's no other way to put it. But if we just say during their phoretic stage, you lose all that detail. And what I don't want beekeepers to do is mask over that detail, because one of the things that I think helps our beekeeping is if we add specificity to what is happening inside of our colonies. If I say in the midsummer you have a lot of phoretic mites, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
If I say in the midsummer you have a lot of non-reproductive mites that feed and kill adult bees, now you get a better picture of what's actually happening inside of your honeybee colony.
Yeah, and that kind of begged the question, and this is just a passing thought, and it's like with varroa sensitive hygiene, especially a queen that's extremely expressing it. You may observe a varroa mite on the back of a bee in that quote unquote phoretic stage, and it doesn't necessarily indicate that there's a serious issue going on if that varroa sensitive hygiene is expressing at a high enough level to where they're removing the mites. That one mite you may be seeing is, non-reproductive. So they don't necessarily remove that particular mite, and they're still in the colony. But it doesn't mean that mite is virus free, right? So, but it's just another demonstration of using all of the data you have available to make these rational decisions based on what you're seeing along with the data available.
Yeah, and you're bringing up something that I think is really important for beekeeping, because we really have to keep it in mind as researchers. You're always going to get some sort of one-off. And I had research colonies last year that were loaded with mites in the middle of the summer, had just as many mites as bees. And then they went through a broodless period, survived the winter, and they're bustling right now. It's a one-off. Doesn't mean that the queens, the bees are resistant in there. It doesn't mean it's the golden goose of queens. It could just be a one-off. It really could. I'm definitely going to do an assay on it.
Right.
I'm interested. Don't
right.
get me wrong. I'm not going to just not look.
More research is necessary.
But just as you brought up, you could have a VSH queen that's highly VSH and still see a mite on an adult bee. Absolutely. It's, you can always get a one-off. I think the problem is if we use those individual case studies and try to explain everything by that one colony, I would be doing a disservice for everyone. But that's one thing that we get into with beekeeping. Whereas we want to approach things more statistically. We want to look at a broader population, a broader number of colonies. And then, what we do is we look at the stats. We say, what was a significant driver of colony loss? And turns out it's consistently varroa.
There's another aspect of the conversation that's been taking place on the sampling versus action threshold, and that there was various ideas about this may change what your threshold is and what your treatment intervention is. But I think what I was hearing and feeling in discussions with my friend Matthew Colby, who's on the board for the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild, and he raised a good point that if you do a sample on your nurse bees and you get 3%, so you say, okay, 3% is my treatment threshold. Now I'm going to intervene. Versus you get a 18% infestation. If you were to take some of the information we learned from your presentation, and we sampled drones, and we've got 18% of the number of drones that we sampled, and we speculate, based on whatever model we're using. If we've come up with a model, let's say we got 18% infestation with drone sampling. That doesn't necessarily mean that a 3% wash on nurse bees is no longer threshold. It actually just creates a correlation. We just don't necessarily know what the correlation is, right?
We don't know what it is yet. It might not be something that always correlates because we're dealing with an aggregated distribution. And also remember, when we do the alcohol wash, you do get drones in that alcohol wash. You have no way of knowing in an alcohol wash whether one or two of those drones had 2 or 3 mites on them. Or if one of those workers happened to emerge with 5 mites on it. It's totally a possibility. And it ended up in the alcohol wash. And so, that's one of the things where it might just be difficult to correlation. But your friend's absolutely right. We do know what the economic threshold of an alcohol wash is at 3%. We don't necessarily know what it is with drones. But I would back up and sometimes we can do things a little less scientifically, but they're extremely field practical. So let's say I was a hobbyist beekeeper and I had 5 to 10 colonies. I got a few colonies in my backyard. right? I enjoy my beekeeping. It's a thing I do on the weekend.
That's an
Awesome.
extreme hobbyist.
And well, one of the things when you have that many colonies is you're able to do comparisons.
Yep.
If I have only one colony, I don't really know if it's aggressive or not, right? If I open it up and I get one sting every time I go into it, is that aggression or not? I only have one colony. It's hard to compare it to anything. If I get 100 stings, I could tell you it's aggressive, but that's an extreme. But if it's not an extreme, I don't know if it's aggressive because I only have one colony. Once I have 10 colonies, I can tell you which colony is aggressive just by comparing it to the rest of them. Same thing with sampling mites on drones. I don't know what the thresholds are right now, but if I go into a colony and I'm just seeing if it needs extra supers and I pick up 30, 40 drones and I have no mites on them, okay, great. I didn't see any detections. I don't know what it means yet, but no detections. I go into the next one, the same thing. The next one, the same thing. I get to the fourth one and half the drones have mites. I don't know what that means yet, but I don't have to necessarily. Field practical logic just tells me in my yard, I have low, 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 high. Maybe I should manage this one differently than my others. And this is where I think management will go, where beekeepers can make really good decisions based upon the information that's in front of them, saying, well, all of these colonies look the same. This one happens to have lots of mites on the drones. Even though I don't know what the threshold is, maybe I should treat this one differently than the rest of them right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. So you got to obviously come up, we've got to have more data. We've got to do more investigation. And this kind of dovetails with the citizen science project that you had mentioned both in the presentation, and we've talked about it a couple of times here. The citizen science project is really specifically aimed at kind of pulling some of this data out so these decisions can be made about the thresholds. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the citizen science project right now, there's a couple of them. And kudos to a master or a beekeeper who is going for her master beekeeper exam later this year. She needs to do a project. She heard me speak at the Colorado State Beekeepers and she asked, could she do this with a group of beekeepers? I was like, yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. She was able to organize 21 beekeepers to be in her project this year. She wrote up, she looked at my presentation, she wrote up her own method, sent it to me. I was delayed getting back to her. That was my fault. And I read through it. She did an amazing job and she's organized 21 beekeepers. I don't know how many colonies are in that study. And she's going to run that project with them for this year in Colorado. And their goal is exactly what you just described, which is with these Colorado beekeepers, is there a predictive value with sampling drones early in the season for which colonies will be heavily infested in the fall? And can we find a comparison between infestation on drones and a paired alcohol wash? So she's doing this all through the season. I'm doing the same thing with the group in Virginia. And our goal with this group in Virginia is see with different management styles, locations in Virginia, do we see a comparison? Can we make a correlation between the percentage of drones that are infested with a paired alcohol wash? And that's what we're really interested in.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of conversation around that was generated as a result of the presentation and the research. And a lot of folks wanted to get involved. And I believe that you had recently mentioned, I think, and the comment section of one of the videos, that there is now an opportunity if others wanted to get involved. Is that right?
It is. I don't even know if it posted online, but I was a little hesitant at first because what I didn't want to do was expand the citizen science project and then not be able to get back to everyone's inquiries in the middle of the summer if there became too many, because I'm running my research and this is an extra thing. And I ultimately decided, let's go ahead and do it. And I made a new Google form, and on my website I made a link and I posted it. I think it posted, but one of the comments didn't post. But we did it. I expanded it up so anyone can join.
It might have been because it was a link. So we'll be sure to include that in the description for this video to make sure that it's in there, because sometimes YouTube will just automatically delete links or external links.
Okay. Good to know.
I don't know. I haven't figured that part out. More research is necessary.
I'm assuming it's because they don't want spam. So.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it.
Mhm.
Yeah, so, for me, the thing that keeps coming up, the question that, keeps coming up for me is like, if there's 6 mites on a drone, how does that equate to, if I were to get 6 mites in a alcohol wash, can I compare the two, right? Because I can wash a colony at 5%, and for me, my threshold, and this could be off the cusp here. For me, my threshold is 5%. I'm not really worried at 5% in most cases, just by nature of my stock. But at 5, 6, 7%, it starts getting more concerning. And then, you talking about 10%, that's just way out of control. Like, we know that you're not going to be able to winter with 10% infestation in, let's say, July or August wash. But if I pull 6 mites off of a drone, like, that tells me, like, we should treat right now, because 6 mites in my head, being trained to do an alcohol wash, 6 mites in a wash it's time to treat.
Yeah, I think what's really important is how many of those drones are infested, not necessarily whether they all clumped on one. By the way, when we seen them on 6-on-1, these are heavily infested colonies, because when my parents and I did the work in Vermont, we also hand did an alcohol wash of worker bees. This was the really intricate work that we did for a summer. And in those colonies where we had lots of mites on the drones, not just a lot of drones had mites on them, but also individual drones would have quite a few, the workers were infested as well. I mean, this is a colony which at some point is going to have more mites than bees, to point that out. But
yeah, it's rough.
it is. So I actually want to bring this up because it was a really important comment someone made, which was someone said after the video that I want everyone. Oh, what was the comment? I essentially said that if you identify colonies that have high mites on the drones, you should split and treat them. And their response was, you're starting over every single time. And I thought about that. I didn't take it as criticism. I thought about that. I'm like, why would this person make that comment? And what information do they have that makes it them think that every time you treat, you're starting over? And I thought it's from this perspective that you should be creating selective pressure on your queens.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought about that, and I have a different view on how we should be applying selective pressure on queens. I don't think we have to go to mortality to create that selection pressure. In my opinion, colonies that cannot suppress mite reproduction effectively to keep the mite levels low, that's already enough for me to remove that queen from the apiaries. I don't have to wait for the colony to die is what I'm getting at.
To make that determination, right?
To make that determination. I'm going to make it the assumption the trajectory is to death. And even if it weren't, it could simply be a one-off. Or there does seem to be something where these colonies that can naturally go through this in the middle of the summer, my observation is they've rebounded from those heavy mite infestations. And so that seems to be this weird little intricacy that I observe every once in a while and don't really know what to do with that, with those observations. They seem to be these outliers, which you can probably tell from my facial expression. Like I'm curious about it. I really am. I'm not dismissive, just curious. But I don't think you're actually starting from zero. What I think you're doing is you're creating a clean slate for the next queen that you want to try with. And this is what I mean by that. I really would like to find queens that produce workers that naturally suppress mite reproduction to a point that infestations cannot get to a lethal threshold. That's great. That's what we're going for. But what I don't want to do is to requeen a heavily infested colony and have that new queen have to deal with the previous mite infestation, because it might surpass her ability to suppress mite reproduction. The theory would kind of be like, she was evolutionarily very fit, but she just wasn't evolved to deal with a nuclear bomb. That's the idea there. So when I say split and treat, the idea is it's easier to treat the smaller colonies, so thus split them. And when you requeen them, you're starting over with a new queen, but the treatment itself wasn't what you're starting over with. It was the starting over is starting with that new queen. I'm simply choosing to treat so that there's not rampant viral circulation, right? Where there's not a huge heavy infestation that she can't produce a new round of her own worker bees to help deal with the varroa.
Right.
You're likely not to get 100% treatment efficacy with any treatment. So there's going to be some residual varroa in there that she'll have to deal with. And hopefully she does deal with it, and you identify a queen line that is great at suppressing mite reproduction. You go forward with that. But I really try to remove all of the confounders as much as possible, so that I'm not having something I'm interested in masked by previous mite infestation or something like that.
Yeah, and that's a more sustainable approach to developing a more sustainable apiary. If you're losing all of your bees, you're not going to be able to produce more bees to give great queens to, and so on and so forth. And you lose those colonies, and you may not actually be able to identify those good genetics. And, from the Sustainable Beekeepers Guild perspective, our goal is to encourage everyone, including the hobbyist who only has 1 to 3 to 4 to 5 colonies, to be able to saturate their drone congregation areas en masse. And, if you've got 20 beekeepers in one locale doing the same thing and following the same approach, give us 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years, that those drone congregation areas are going to be well saturated with, good genetics. Mm-hmm. And you have to have bees in order to get there. You can't keep starting over with no bees. And that, for the individual who can't replenish their stock on a regular basis, let's say capturing swarms, buying in packages, buying nukes every year, that is not a sustainable approach. It's going to get expensive. It's going to get discouraging, and it's going to get really, really problematic for other beekeepers in the area as well.
Yeah, and James, you're bringing up exactly the point that we talked about beforehand, before we started recording, which is there's this treadmill so many beekeepers are on, which is they're working very hard to keep their bees healthy, keep them alive. Whether they're treatment-free or treating, they're working really hard at it. But they're on this treadmill of buying in new packages or new nucleus colonies every spring, watching them be robust through the year, and then some of them die in the fall, and then they take on tons of mites in the fall, or they observe tons and they die in the winter and they start over again. We want to get off of this treadmill. So in response to that person, it's not the treatment, in my opinion, that's starting over again. It's replacing that queen that's starting over again. I'm simply asking you to do that treatment far earlier. Don't do it in the fall in September when your whole colony's already been parasitized. What am I actually protecting now? Nothing. Right. What about in Maryland right now? We have swarms. I have colonies that are capping honey up in the honey supers. They look great. But I can go out there right now and identify colonies that are heavily infested in their adult drones. I would love to split those, treat them, and then give them my new daughter queens that I've already made. They can go through the whole summer now. If I was not doing research, produce honey for me, produce a huge, robust population, and I can still monitor them. The ones that didn't suppress mite reproduction, where the mites are increasing, I can choose to say, hey, I want to do a requeen again. Again, I want to get a line in there that I can challenge and say, show me that you can suppress mite reproduction. What I don't want to do is do it after the colony's already been compromised by varroa, because then what am I testing? I'm testing too many different things at once. And then it's hard to know what's in the soup. It's really easy if it's just tomato soup. It's really, really hard if it's gazpacho.
Yeah, and that's the trick, right? That's again where we come in to reinforce bringing in those good queens right at the start, because it seems to be that treadmill perspective like we were talking about. I wish we would have recorded it, but the notion that you have a colony and you watch them grow, they're robust, and then they start declining, and then you come up with a solution, but it's too late, and then you don't have the queen to come up with the solution. And then there's no market viability for these, like the queens, they're not around. So you can't really start with that approach, and then you're stuck again without bees, and then you're discouraged, and then you're falling off the radar. And, we really want to continue to not only provide good queen stock for the beekeepers in our region, and we're really encouraging other beekeepers in their regions to do the same and to replicate this model. Is, be a good neighbor, share good queen stock, and keep watching for that that one queen that stands out and then replicate from her and continue to do that. And you'll be able to make some headway. And we won't be at this point where we're constantly having to treat the colonies because we'll have so much, positive genetics in the colonies ourselves, our apiaries.
Yeah. And the other reason I think it's really important to maybe approach your varroa management this way is ideally, if you have X number of colonies, it's a minority of those colonies that are heavily infested.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the aggregated distribution, but now on a colony level, where if I have a bunch of colonies, there should only be a handful of them that are heavily infested. That would be an aggregated distribution. And this is what I want to see. Where all my parasites are in a couple colonies, I deal with those as individual issues. When my colonies are broadly infested, now I have a problem. Now my infestation is endemic in everyone, and I have an issue, and it's really hard to get ahead. The other reason I really point this out is anyone that's had surplus healthy colonies to deal with, it's actually a good problem to have. What do I do with all of these bees? I've taken 20 colonies before and made 100 nukes from them.
Right. Yeah.
Now I have a lot of new colonies to host a couple queen lines to see how productive are they, how good are they with mites, etc. If I have a handful of overwintered colonies that are heavily infested, I can't test out new queens. I can't supply great drones to drone congregating areas. Or would you really want me to? My heavily infested drones going off to mate with your queens. So this is where I see it's not starting over with a treatment. It's actually starting over when you do that requeen.
Yeah, and that's kind of the gist of what I was trying to get at. Is like usually you're not starting out with a good start with a package, and in some cases a nuke when it comes to resistance. You might be getting great bees, and they may have been cared for very well by a great beekeeper. They took care of the mites and the viruses, and you're going to get good bees. But sometimes they're not going to have the genetic composition that they need to survive without a treatment intervention and monitoring and sampling. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're coming from. It's not that easy to just start out from scratch with 3 colonies from 3 random places or the same place and be able to really accomplish this goal versus somebody who's got 40 colonies and could suffer attrition. It's not necessarily ideal, but if you could suffer attrition, you could still, build from what you have left over, but that's not necessarily going to be sustainable because one year you might have just ruined all of your bees and lost every one of them because of the viruses and the mites.
Yeah. And so when I come right back to that comment I made, your selection pressure doesn't have to be all the way to mortality. So if I'm testing out, is this colony capable of handling varroa? I could follow that to the end of the colony's life. Or I could just say at this threshold, and this is more along with lines of Darwinian beekeeping, where Seeley says, at some point, if it's about, I forget what he says for a threshold, you simply dispose of the colony, you euthanize it.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to euthanize your colonies, but that similar principle. Okay, the colony is heavily infested. It surpassed my economic threshold by an alcohol wash. I could just watch it all the way to death. It may or may not live the winter. If it does, it's likely still to have high number of mites and be an issue for my other non-infested colonies. I'm going to create the selection pressure artificially right now, squish the queen, split it, treat it. Now I have more healthy colonies to try out these new queens in. And that I think is just a far better model because now I'm not dealing with an older colony with rampant viral circulation. I don't know. I don't know of any study. I'm sure they're out there. If comb is a reservoir for viruses in your honeybee colony, if just those older bees hanging around there are, or any of the stored bee bread, I don't want to deal with any of those confounding issues when I'm trying out a new queen. That's where I think the earlier management's the better.